The Great Hall of the Galactic Concord was enormous, a dome of shining crystal and dark metal that floated in the high orbit of Carath Prime, the one neutral world that no empire dared to touch. Inside that hall, hundreds of alien delegates sat in their wide, curved seats, speaking in dozens of different languages through their small translation devices and arguing about the same thing they had argued about for the past 3 weeks. The Vreth hegemony was moving again. Though the Vreth were not a quiet or a gentle people, they were tall, heavily scaled, and ancient, an empire that had been taking other people's worlds since before most current civilizations had even learned to sail their own seas. Their warships were fast and brutal. Their ground soldiers were feared across 7 full sectors of the galaxy, and their Grand Council had decided, without much debate or hesitation, that the Outer Rim belonged to them now, and that anyone who disagreed was simply wrong and would be corrected soon enough. Director Yael Morrow sat in the human delegation's assigned section near the back of the hall, a spot that had, over 40 years of Concord membership, become quietly accepted as humanity's permanent place. Not at the front where the great empires sat, not at the center where the mid-tier powers argued, but near the back, in the rows where the smaller and less powerful members were expected to sit and listen. Yael was a tall woman with sharp, dark eyes and a calm, steady face that gave away nothing of what she was thinking. And right now she was thinking quite a great deal. The Vreth representative, a thick-necked creature named Drath Khan, was standing at the central podium with his enormous arms folded across his chest and his yellow eyes moving slowly around the room with an expression that looked very much like boredom mixed with contempt. He had just finished explaining, in slow and deliberate language, to disagree was welcome to come and make. To disagree was welcome to come and make that argument in person, at the border, with whatever fleet they could manage to bring. No one laughed out loud at that, but several delegates smiled in exactly the way people smile when a joke has been made very clearly at someone else's expense. And then the delegate from the Lyun Assembly, a thin, blue-feathered creature named First Voice Ariel, turned slowly in her seat and looked directly at Yael with large, careful, sympathetic eyes. "Perhaps," Ariel said, in a tone that was soft and politely worded but carried a clear and sharp edge under it, "the human delegation might wish to consider a Concord-sponsored relocation of their civilian population, given the, shall we say, exposed nature of their home system's position in the current environment." The room went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Drath Khan made a sound deep in his chest, a sound his translator converted into a short, flat laugh. He turned his wide head toward the back rows and looked directly at Yael with the kind of slow, satisfied expression that needed absolutely no translation from any device. "The humans?" he said, loudly enough that every translator in the room picked it up clearly. "You are asking the humans what they think about military matters?" He tilted his head just slightly. "Director Morrow, your people operate 3 aging frigates and 1 destroyer that, according to our records, was constructed before my grandfather finished hatching. What exactly would relocating you accomplish, other than saving everyone the minor inconvenience of stepping around you when something real happens?" Several delegates at the nearby tables looked away carefully, he studying their data screens with sudden great interest. Several others did not bother looking away at all. Yael Morrow held Drath Khan's gaze for a long, quiet moment, 4 full seconds, which in a room that silent felt much longer. Her face did not change. Her hands, resting flat on the table in front of her, did not move. She did not raise her voice, and she did not lower it. She simply said, "Thank you for your concern, Representative Drath Khan," and sat back in her chair. And the session ground on for another 2 hours after that, with nothing decided and the situation made slightly worse in several small ways, which was, in Yael's experience, the Galactic Concord's most reliable and consistent talent. When the session finally broke, she walked out through the long lower corridor of the station and stopped at a wide viewing port that looked out at open space and a thick spray of distant stars. Her assistant, a young man named Piotr Wen, appeared at her shoulder almost immediately, holding a slim data tablet in both hands. "Director," he said, keeping his voice low and even, "we received a transmission from Earth's Joint Strategic Command approximately 40 minutes ago. Classified Black Priority." Black Priority was a security level that Yael had only seen used twice in her entire career. She took the tablet from his hands without looking down at it and held it flat against her chest for a long moment, still watching the stars outside the viewport. Then, without any visible change in her expression, she looked down and read the message. It was 4 sentences. The first told her to share nothing, not with allies, not with press, not with any Concord official, regardless of their rank or her relationship with them. The second told her to return to Earth on the next available transport. The third told her that after 11 years of cold silence and darkness, the engines were running again. And the fourth sentence was only 4 words long. "It is time." Yael stood still for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. Piotr watched her face carefully and saw something there that he had genuinely never seen before. Not fear and not quite excitement either, but something heavier and quieter than both. It was the look of someone who had been carrying a very long and very heavy secret and had just been given permission to finally, after all this time, set it down. "Cancel everything remaining on our schedule," she said, and her voice was steady and calm as always. "Book us on the first available transit home." "Should I give the Secretariat a reason for the early departure?" Piotr asked. "Tell them the director has been recalled for internal consultations," she said, and began walking toward the transit bay. "It happens to be entirely true." Behind them in the main hall, Drath Khan was still at the podium, accepting the quiet, the nervous congratulations of several smaller delegates who had decided that agreeing with the most powerful voice in the room was a reasonable form of personal safety. He received their words with easy confidence and thought nothing at all, not one single thought, about the human woman who had sat near the back of the room, said almost nothing, and left early. He would think about that silence again later, but by the time he did, there would be nothing useful left to do with the memory. Deep below the frozen surface of Europa, in pressurized corridors carved through ancient ice, power conduits that had been cold and quiet for 11 years were warming now. Slowly at first, a low hum, a flicker of lights running in sequence down hallways so long that the far end disappeared into darkness, and then faster, steadier, stronger. Workers in sealed white suits moved quickly and without unnecessary conversation, checking readings and confirming numbers in short, clipped radio exchanges. What none of them could fully hide, even behind professional calm and the visors of their helmets, was the look that crossed every single face when they passed the reinforced observation windows and looked out at what they had been building and guarding and waiting on for so many long and patient years. It was not just large. It was the kind of large that took a moment to understand, the kind where the eye keeps trying to find the edge and keeps failing. And it did not look like a ship so much as it looked like an entire city that had quietly decided, after long and careful thought, that it was ready to go somewhere. On the main command board, deep in the heart of the facility, a single indicator light shifted from amber to a steady, unwavering green. The UES Prometheus Unbound was awake. Admiral Dara Ose had walked long corridors in her life, the narrow gray halls of training academies, the tight service passages of patrol frigates, and the wide ceremonial walkways of Earth's Joint Strategic Command headquarters, but nothing she had ever walked through had prepared her for this. The main internal corridor of Deck 7 on the UES Prometheus Unbound was wide enough to drive 6 large transport vehicles side by side and still have room left over on both ends. The ceiling above was so high that the upper catwalks and cable runs looked like thin lines drawn in pencil against a very distant ceiling. Every surface was clean, lit, and humming with the low, steady vibration of a ship that had just finished waking up from 11 years of powered-down silence. Dara walked slowly, and she did not rush herself. She had earned the right to take her time with this. Behind her, 3 steps back and silent, walked her senior crew chief, a large and quiet man named Chief Engineer Tobias Reeve, and who carried a flat operations board and said nothing unless asked, which was one of the many reasons Dara had specifically requested him for this post 4 years ago. "Full power across all primary decks," she asked, without turning around. "Full power across all primary decks confirmed, Admiral. Reactors 1 through 8 running at baseline, reactors 9 and 10 standing at 70% and climbing," Tobias said. "Hey, fighter bays?" "All 12 bays pressurized and active. First wing of 300 has already completed pre-flight checks." Dara stopped walking and looked out through a wide internal viewport that looked down into Fighter Bay 3 from a high observation angle. Below her, row after row of human-built strike fighters sat in perfectly ordered lines, their hulls dark and angular, their pilots moving around them in orange flight suits doing final manual checks. The 3,000 fighters in total were distributed across all 12 bays, and the sight of even one bay's worth was enough to make the chest feel tight in a very specific way. She turned away from the viewport and kept walking. The Prometheus Unbound was 14 kilometers long from bow to stern, a number that, when spoken out loud, tended to produce confused silence in anyone hearing it for the first time. It carried its 12 fighter bays, 80 dedicated gunship berths, and along its wide flanks, 12 Lance-class destroyers sat locked into docking cradles, fully crewed and ready to detach and fight independently on command. Running along the full center line of the ship, from midsection to forward bow, was the main railgun spine, a weapon system capable of accelerating a dense tungsten rod to a speed and force that military engineers had quietly described in their internal documents as sufficient to significantly alter the structural integrity of a small moon. They had written it that way because writing it the direct way felt uncomfortable even to the people who had built it. The ship had taken 30 years to complete. 30 years of construction spread across 3 secret facilities, funded through budget lines that were labeled with names like Deep Survey Equipment Maintenance and Long-Term Geological Stabilization Research, and other phrases that sounded boring enough that no one in any Concorde monitoring body had ever looked twice at them. The people who had designed that particular funding approach were, Dara had always thought, some of the most quietly talented individuals in human history. It had all started after 2151, after the Karath incident, as it was known in classified records, or that near-catastrophic first contact situation, as the people who had actually been there tended to call it in private. A small human exploration vessel had crossed into a contested zone without knowing it was contested, and had found itself facing 3 Vreth patrol cruisers that saw a ship they did not recognize and responded accordingly. The human crew had survived, barely, because the Vreth patrol commander had chosen to send a warning rather than an immediate strike, a choice made on personal discretion, not on any policy of restraint. Earth's Strategic Command had looked at that incident very carefully and had drawn from it one clear and simple conclusion. Being helpless was not a position that humanity could afford to maintain. Being humble was fine. Being friendly and cooperative was fine. Being the new and junior member of a large and complicated galactic community was fine, and probably unavoidable for some time. but being genuinely, physically unable to defend its own people, that was not a condition that Earth was willing to accept as permanent. So they had built, quietly, patiently, and with the kind of long-term thinking that came from looking at the galaxy around them and deciding that whatever they built, it needed to be worth the wait. The crew of 40,000 had been assembled over years, drawn from every nation on Earth and from the human colonies on Mars and in the asteroid belt. Many of them had told their families they worked in deep space survey operations, or in long-cycle construction management, or in any of a dozen other jobs that were dull enough to explain long absences without raising questions. Some of them had maintained that cover story for so long that parts of it felt almost real even to them. Dara stopped at the entrance to the main bridge, a wide room of dark consoles and large display screens that curved in a half-circle around the forward command station. Her bridge crew stood at their posts, 40 men and women representing as many different countries and backgrounds as 40 people could reasonably cover. And when she walked in, every one of them straightened slightly without being told to. She stood in front of her command chair for a moment and looked at the main forward screen, which currently showed a wide external view of space ahead, dark, deep, and full of distant light. "I want to say something before we move," she said, loud enough for every person on the bridge to hear clearly. "I know most of you have been waiting a long time for this day, some of you longer than others, and some of you have given up things to be here that I know were not easy to give up." She paused for just a moment. "What we are going to do is not about revenge for being laughed at, and it is not about proving anything to anyone for the sake of pride." She looked around the room at the faces watching her. "What we are going to do is go out there and make sure that the next time something large and dangerous moves toward people who cannot stop it. There is something in this galaxy that can and will." She looked back at the forward screen. "That is what this ship is for. That is what all of you are for, and that is more than enough reason." The bridge was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable quiet of uncertainty, but the solid, settled quiet of people who had already decided where they stood a long time ago. "Chief Navigator," Dara said, sitting down in her command chair. "Take us out!" The Prometheus Unbound detached from its Europa berth with a series of deep, resonant thuds as the docking clamps released in sequence. Each one felt rather than heard, traveling up through the deck plating and into the boots of everyone standing on it. The ship moved slowly at first, easing out of the underground berth through a tunnel cut straight through the ice until the tunnel ended and the open darkness of space began. No transponder signal was broadcast, so no identification code was sent to any Concorde monitoring station. No comm channel was open to any listening post or patrol vessel. The Prometheus Unbound moved out of the shadow of Europa and pointed itself at the edge of the solar system, running completely dark and completely silent. It was, from the outside, just another patch of space where there happened to be no stars visible. Dara sat in her chair, watched the navigation display. Diane let the hum of the ship work its way through her bones like something she had been waiting to feel for a very long time, because she had been. Ahead of them, somewhere past the edge of the solar system and several FTL jumps beyond it, a colony of 400 million people on a world called Thesson 4 was about to have a very bad 18 hours. And after those 18 hours, the galaxy was going to have a question it had never thought to ask itself before. A question about what humanity had actually been doing with all that quiet time. The distress signal from Thesson 4 reached 214 separate monitoring stations across 4 sectors simultaneously, and for 11 straight hours, every single one of those stations did absolutely nothing. It was not that the beings running those stations did not care. Many of them cared quite genuinely. The Thessani people were well-liked. Their colony was known as a peaceful and productive place, and the thought of 400 million civilians being absorbed into the Vreth hegemony by force was a thought that made most decent beings deeply uncomfortable. But discomfort and action were very different things, and the cold truth of the situation was simple. The nearest Concorde response fleet was 6 full days of FTL travel away. The Vreth battle group moving toward Thesson 4 would arrive in less than 18 hours, and no single civilization within range had the military strength to put itself between those two facts without being destroyed for the effort. So the monitoring stations logged the distress signal, forwarded it to their respective governments, and quietly waited for someone else to do something. On the surface of Thesson 4, in the capital city of Vel Shara, and the civilian population received the news in stages. First, the official government broadcast, which used careful language and urged calm, then the independent news networks, which used less careful language and did not particularly urge calm, and then the simple visible evidence of the night sky, where the small defense platforms that orbited their world were powering up their weapons with nowhere near enough firepower to matter. And the Thessani Elder Council sent one final message to the Concorde, short and direct. We ask again, is there anyone who can come? For 4 hours, that message received no reply. Then, from a source that identified itself only as Earth Vessel Unregistered, a single transmission arrived at the Thessani Defense Command Center. 2 sentences long and marked with a priority code that no Thessani communications officer had ever seen before and could not find in any directory. The first sentence said that an Earth vessel was in the system and was moving to intercept the incoming Vreth formation. The second sentence said, "Please ask your people to stay indoors." The senior communications officer, a young Thessani woman named Velsar, read those 2 sentences 3 times. Then she looked at her colleague across the console and said with complete sincerity, "I have no idea what this means, but I am going to believe it anyway." Grand Admiral Kreth Val commanded the Vreth battle group from the bridge of his flagship, the heavy carrier HFY Unbroken Will, and he had been in a very good mood for the past 2 days. The operation was clean, the timing was solid, and the opposition, what little existed, was nowhere near organized enough to matter. 200 warships under his command, the finest in the hegemony's outer fleet, moving in clean formation toward a target that had no meaningful ability to resist. His tactical officer, a young and efficient officer named Srath, turned from her console and reported crisply, "Admiral, long-range sensors are detecting an object at bearing 370, moving to intercept on a direct approach vector." Kreth Val looked up from the operational map he had been reviewing. "Concorde vessel?" "No registry match, sir. Running the silhouette now," Srath said, and then she was quiet for a moment longer than Kreth Val expected. He turned to look at her directly. She was staring at her screen with an expression that was working very hard to remain professional and not entirely succeeding. "Sir, the silhouette does not match any vessel type in our database, any database, and the dimensional readings are returning values that I am going to read out loud, even though they do not seem correct. Length is returning at approximately 14 kilometers. E-beam at 3 kilometers, vertical profile at 1.8. The bridge went very quiet. "Run the scan again," Kreth Val said. "I have run it 4 times, Admiral." He stood up from his command seat and walked to the tactical display. On the screen, at the center of a web of scan lines and data readouts, was a shape, dark, angular, and so large that his first instinct was that the instrument must be picking up an asteroid or a rogue station fragment. But asteroids did not move on direct intercept courses, and they did not broadcast on military communications frequencies, and they did not send hails, which this thing was now doing. Kreth Val straightened his posture, clasped his hands behind his back, and said, "Put it through." The voice that came through the bridge speakers was calm, clear, and unhurried, the voice of someone sitting comfortably and in no particular rush. "Vreth Battle Group, this is Admiral Dara Ose, the commanding officer of the UES Prometheus Unbound. operating under the authority of Earth's Joint Strategic Command. You are on a heading toward a protected civilian population of 400 million people, and I am formally asking you to reverse your course and withdraw from this system. I will ask this one time, and I want to be clear that I mean one time exactly, not as a figure of speech, but as an accurate description of how many times the asking is going to happen. Krethval looked at his flag captain. His flag captain looked back at him with an expression that was carefully neutral but had something uncertain moving underneath it. "Earth," the flag captain said, very quietly. Krethval turned back to the screen, looked at the vast shape on his tactical display for another moment, and then made his decision with the confidence of a commander who had 200 warships at his back and a 40-year history of never needing to reconsider anything. "Target the unknown vessel with forward batteries," he said. "Full power, all front lines. Let them understand what they are dealing with." The first salvo from 64 Vreth cruisers hit the Prometheus Unbound directly and all at once, a concentrated wall of energy and kinetic fire that, by any reasonable calculation, should have caused significant and immediate structural damage to any vessel of any size currently known to exist in the galaxy. The Prometheus Unbound did not stop moving. It did not alter its course by a single degree. It did not slow down, speed up, or make any evasive action whatsoever. It simply continued on its heading at exactly the same speed it had been traveling before the salvo hit, the way a mountain continues to be a mountain when someone throws a stone at it. On the bridge, Dadara looked at her damage report screen. "Shield status?" she asked. "Forward shields at 91%, Admiral," the tactical officer reported. Dara nodded once. She looked at the forward screen, where the Vreth formation was now close enough to resolve into individual ship shapes. 200 vessels, spread wide and deep, all of them now running active weapons. She thought about the 400 million people on the world behind her who had been told to stay indoors. "Da open a return channel," she said. "Channel open, Admiral." She looked at the screen and spoke in a voice that was perfectly level and not unkind, a voice that carried in it no anger and no satisfaction, only the plain, direct weight of a fact being stated clearly. "Your turn," she said. The Prometheus Unbound opened fire. Then the railgun's spine along the ship's center line discharged first, a single rod that crossed the distance to the nearest Vreth cruiser so fast that the targeting system registered the hit before the human eye could follow the shot. The cruiser's forward section simply ceased to exist. The ship behind it, which had been far enough away to be considered safe by any previous standard of naval combat, was struck by the debris expansion and lost power across its entire port side in the same second. But then the fighter bays opened. 3,000 fighters came out in a wave that took 4 seconds to fully deploy, a wall of dark, fast shapes spreading wide in every direction and immediately breaking into attack formations with a coordination that spoke of years of practice in exactly this situation. The gunships followed 30 seconds behind, 80 of them moving to cover angles and cut off retreat vectors. Krethval stood on his bridge and watched his tactical display with the expression of a person who has just understood something important a great deal later than they should have. "All ships, emergency defensive formation," he ordered, and his voice was steady, because he was a professional, and he had not survived this long by losing his composure when things went wrong. But his hands, hidden behind his back, were not entirely steady. The Karath corridor became, for the next 3.5 hours, a very different place than it had been that morning. And on the surface of Thesson 4, in the capital city of Velshara, the communications officer Velsar stood at her station watching the battle unfold on the defense network's sensor feeds, with tears running down her face for reasons she could not have fully explained and did not try to. The battle lasted 3 hours and 51 minutes. When it was over, the 163 Vreth vessels had been disabled or destroyed. Disabled being far more common than destroyed, because Admiral Osei had given explicit orders that the goal was to stop the fleet, not to erase it. 22 ships had managed to turn and run before the fighter wings fully enclosed the formation, and Dara had let them go deliberately. She wanted them to get home. She wanted them to have to explain what had happened and what had done it. In front of their own commanders and their own Grand Council, in their own language with their own faces. Grand Admiral Kreth Val was not among those who ran. His flagship had been crippled in the first hour. One of the Lance destroyers detached from the Prometheus Unbound's flank had taken it apart with a degree of methodical precision that Kreth Val later described in his captivity debriefing, and as insulting in its calmness. He was taken alive from the bridge of the Unbroken Will by a boarding team of 12 humans in dark armor, and he sat in a holding room aboard the Prometheus Unbound for several hours, saying nothing and thinking a very great deal. The Prometheus Unbound took no significant damage. Its shields had absorbed everything the Vreth fleet threw at it, and by the end of the engagement, the forward shields were still sitting above 70%. Two fighters had been lost. Their pilots recovered alive from ejection capsules, and one gunship had sustained hull damage to its port side that Tobias Reeve cheerfully estimated would take about a week to repair properly. Then Dara did something that none of her senior staff had been told in advance she was going to do. She authorized the Thessani Defense Network to receive and rebroadcast the full tactical record of the engagement, every sensor feed, every visual from the external cameras, every communications exchange from the opening hail to the final ceasefire order, on the open galactic broadcast frequency that every listening station in the sector monitored. She did not explain her reasoning to her staff. She did not need to. Every person on that bridge understood exactly what their admiral was doing, and not one of them objected. Within 3 hours, the footage was everywhere. Shh. In the Vreth High Command's primary council chamber, 12 of the most powerful military minds in the hegemony sat around a table and watched the full recording in complete silence. They watched Kreth Val's opening salvo hit the Prometheus Unbound and produce no meaningful result. They watched the railgun discharge. They watched 3,000 fighters emerge from a single vessel like a storm front rolling off an ocean. They watched 200 ships, their ships, and the finest outer fleet the hegemony had, come apart over 4 hours against one opponent that was not even scratched in any way that mattered. When the recording ended, the chamber was quiet for a very long moment. Then the senior council member, a very old general named Vrar Keth, said in a low voice, "How long have they had it?" No one at the table had a good answer. That was, in many ways, the most frightening part. In the Leon Assembly's Central Broadcast Center, the recording was playing on every public screen in the building, and the senior staff, who had just days ago suggested to Director Morrow that humanity might want to consider a quiet relocation of its civilian population, were watching it with expressions that ranged from stunned to deeply embarrassed. First Voice Ariel stood alone in her private office, watching the footage on her personal screen, and she stood there for a very long time without sitting down. She thought about the way Yael Morrow had looked at Drath Khan in the council chamber, steady, calm, and entirely unaffected, and she began to understand that the steadiness had not been patience in the face of an insult. It had been something else entirely, something that, in retrospect, she should have recognized. The intelligence agencies of 12 separate civilizations had spent a combined total of roughly 400,000 work hours over the previous 4 decades monitoring human military activity and producing reports that all reached broadly the same conclusion. Humanity was a minor military power with limited ambitions and no meaningful force projection capability beyond their own solar system. Those 400,000 hours of work were now, as of approximately 1,400 hours Galactic Standard Time, worth nothing at all. Emergency review sessions were opened on the same day in the Greth Dominion, the Kalvan Federated Systems, the Tharic Sovereignty, and 6 other major civilizations. Intelligence directors were called to account by their governments. The core question that dominated every one of those sessions was the same question, asked in different languages with the same tight, the worried tone underneath. If they built one, how many more are there? Humanity did not answer that question. Director Morrow, who had arrived back on Earth and been fully briefed before the battle even ended, held one short press statement in which she confirmed that the UES Prometheus Unbound was an Earth vessel operating under legitimate military authority, that its mission had been the protection of civilian life in the Karath corridor, and that further details would be made available through the appropriate Concord channels. When a Calvan News representative asked directly how many vessels of this class were currently in active service, Yael smiled, a small, composed, completely unreadable smile, and said, "That information is classified," and ended the statement. It was the classified that truly frightened people. A clear denial would have been uncomfortable but manageable. A classified was a door that could hide anything behind it. And every military intelligence analyst in the galaxy spent the next several days staring at that door and not sleeping well. The Galactic Concord called an emergency full assembly within 24 hours of the battle's end. It was the fastest the Concord had ever been called to session in its entire history, faster even than the session after the Moran Cluster incident of 2099, which had previously held the record. The Director Morrow arrived on Karath Prime Station and walked through the lower corridor toward the main hall, the same long corridor she had walked just days ago, stopping at the same viewport that looked out at the same stars. This time, she did not stop. She walked straight through, and when she reached the entrance to the main hall, the door was opened by a Concord official who had been waiting specifically to open it for her. She was shown to the first chair offered. Not the back rows. The first chair. The chair at the center forward position, closest to the main podium, typically reserved for the civilizations whose names appeared earliest in the Concord's founding records. The delegate who had been sitting in that chair before she arrived had moved without being asked. When Yael sat down and looked around the room at the hundreds of faces looking back at her, some afraid, some respectful, some openly calculating, and a very small number genuinely pleased, she kept her expression exactly as it had always been, calm, composed, and giving away nothing. Somewhere in the galaxy, in a cell that was clean and reasonably comfortable, a young Vreth political reformer named Suravel had just watched the full battle recording on the small screen in her room, placed there by a guard who was himself not a supporter of the war, though he had never said so out loud. Suravel was a thin woman with sharp intelligence and a very long list of political enemies, and she had been in this cell for 8 months for the crime of publicly opposing the hegemony's expansion policy. She watched the Prometheus Unbound hold position between the Vreth fleet and the Thessani colony world, and she watched 3,000 human fighters pour out of its bays, and she watched Grand Admiral Kreth Val's flagship go dark. And then she sat back on her narrow cot and looked at the ceiling for a while. The political situation inside the hegemony, which had already been unstable before this battle, had just become significantly more interesting. She allowed herself a small, but careful smile, the kind of smile that carries within it a great many complicated thoughts at once. And she began, quietly and with care, to plan. The shuttle came down through Thesson 4's pale yellow sky on a clear morning, 3 days after the battle, and landed on the wide-open plaza outside the government center in Vel Shara, with a low, soft hum that faded quickly into the normal sounds of a city going carefully back to its ordinary life. Admiral Dara Osei stepped out first, alone, without a security escort. A decision her staff had objected to briefly and then accepted because they knew her well enough to know when an objection was going to accomplish nothing useful. She wore her uniform, dark blue with the Earth flag on the left shoulder, and she carried nothing in her hands. She had expected some kind of formal reception, a line of officials, a prepared statement, perhaps a short ceremony of the kind that governments arrange when they need to turn a large emotional event into something manageable and organized. What she found instead was people. They were simply there, thousands of them, standing in the plaza and along the wide steps of the government center and up the streets that led away in every direction from it. The Sani people, with their wide, dark eyes and their pale silver skin. Grell people, shorter and broader. She had simply come to be present at the same 1999, had simply come to be present at the same place at the same time as the person who had come when no one else would. Dara walked down the shuttle ramp and stood on the plaza stones and looked out at all those faces looking back at her. And she felt something move in her chest that she had not fully anticipated, even though she probably should have. A small figure pushed carefully through the crowd near the front. A Thessani child, perhaps 6 years old by rough estimate, with large, curious eyes and a cluster of the blue-silver flowers that grew in window boxes all over Velshara, held carefully in both small hands. And the child walked across the open space between the crowd and the shuttle ramp with the completely confident seriousness that very young children sometimes display when they have decided they are going to do something important. The child stopped in front of Dara, held the flowers up, and said something in Thessani that Dara's translation earpiece rendered as, "These are for you because you came." Dara crouched down to the child's level, took the flowers gently with both hands, and said, "I thank you. That means a very great deal to me." She said it simply, without ceremony, and she meant every word of it with the full weight of everything that had brought her to this plaza on this morning. The crowd did not cheer. It was quieter than that, and more serious, and in its own way that was better than cheering. 2 days after Thesson IV, Director Yael Morrow stood at the main podium of the Galactic Concord Grand Assembly and delivered the address that every civilization in the known galaxy was watching, in real time, on every available broadcast channel they had. She spoke for 18 minutes. She did not use dramatic language or long, complicated arguments. She spoke clearly, in plain terms, about what Earth had done and why, not as a confession, and not as an apology, but as a simple, honest account given by one equal party to other equal parties. She explained the Karath incident of 2151 and the decision that came out of it. She explained that humanity had made a choice to build its own ability to protect itself and others, not because it distrusted the conquered, but because it had learned, as every adult eventually learns, that trust and preparation are not opposites, and that choosing one does not mean abandoning the other. So she described the 30 years of construction, the people involved, the resources committed, the long patience required, and she described the decision to act at Thesson IV not as an act of aggression or territorial ambition, but as the only available answer to a question that 400 million people were asking and that the Concord had been unable to answer in time. When she reached the end of her prepared text, she paused, folded her notes, set them flat on the podium, and said the words that would be quoted more than anything else she had ever said in her long career. Not because they were complicated, but because they were not. You asked us to come in peace, and we came in peace. You asked us to be humble, and we were humble. You asked us to participate quietly and to learn the rules of this community, and we did all of those things sincerely and without resentment. She looked around the hall, meeting eyes where she could. But you never asked us to be defenseless, and we never agreed to be." The assembly was quiet for 4 full seconds after she stopped speaking. Then the Thessani ambassador, who was seated directly across the floor from the human delegation, rose from her seat and began to applaud, a gesture borrowed directly from human cultural tradition, which she had apparently researched and practiced for exactly this purpose. 2 more delegations rose within seconds, then 5 more, then a dozen, and then half the room. Not everyone stood. Some sat with expressions of deep calculation, trying to understand the new shape of the galaxy they were living in. Some sat with expressions of clear unease, rethinking assumptions they had held as settled facts for decades. That was fine. Yael had expected both, and she respected the honesty of a reaction that did not pretend to feel something it did not feel. But enough stood that it meant something real. Though the Vreth hegemony entered formal ceasefire negotiations within the week, driven by internal political pressure that had been building for years, and that the events at Thesson 4 had accelerated dramatically. Grand Admiral Kreth Val was returned to the hegemony as part of the initial diplomatic exchange. He walked off the transport with a very different expression than the one he had worn boarding it. And he said very little to the press representatives waiting for him at the landing pad. In a city on the Vreth homeworld, Suravel, released from her cell as part of a package of political concessions that the reformist movement had been pushing for before the ceasefire and had suddenly found much easier to push for after it, held her first public address in 8 months to a crowd that was larger than anyone had predicted. She spoke about a different kind of future. And not everyone in the hegemony was listening yet, but more were listening than had been before, and that was where every real change always started. On the bridge of the Prometheus Unbound, Admiral Dara Ose stood at the wide observation port that ran along the starboard side of the command level and looked out at the stars with a cup of coffee wrapped in both hands, real coffee, from a small independent roaster in Accra, and of which she had brought a truly unreasonable supply aboard before departure, and which her senior staff had already started referring to among themselves as the ship's most critical strategic resource. Chief Engineer Tobias Reeve appeared at her shoulder, holding his operations board and wearing the expression of a man who had news he was pleased to deliver. "Admiral, comms has just confirmed movement on the Concord Channel," he said. Both vessels have cleared the solar system and are proceeding to their assigned patrol sectors as scheduled. The other two, the sister ships, built in the same long years of silence, under the same ice and rock, by the same patient hands, were now moving out into the galaxy on their own courses. Every intelligence analyst who had been lying awake at night with the question, if they built one, how many more, now had a partial answer. The answer was, at least 3, and it was partial on purpose. Dara looked out at the stars for a moment longer. She thought about the child in Velshara with the blue flowers, and about Yael Morrow standing at a podium and speaking plainly to a room full of civilizations that were finally paying real attention. She thought about 30 years of construction in the cold and the dark, and 40 years of sitting at the back of the room and being laughed at by people who had made a very expensive mistake. She thought about the 400 million people on Thesson 4 who had gone to sleep 3 nights ago, not knowing if they would still be free in the morning, and who had woken up the next day to a different answer than they had been expecting. She took a slow sip of her coffee, which was, by any reasonable measure, excellent, and let the hum of the ship move up through the deck plating and into her boots and through her whole body, the way it had since the day they undocked from Europa. Then outside the viewport, the stars did not move. They never did, from the inside looking out. You had to move toward them yourself and keep moving, and trust that the direction you had chosen was worth the long journey to get there. Dara had no doubts about the direction. She turned from the viewport, set her coffee down on the console ledge with the unhurried ease of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be, and said, "Navigator, next heading." Please!" And the Prometheus Unbound moved on through the dark, patient and vast and alive, with the stars ahead of it and the long story of its making behind it, a ship built by a species that had decided, long ago and in quiet, that the galaxy was large and not always kind, and that the best answer to that fact was not fear and not retreat and not silence. The best answer was to be ready, and they were.